Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 186, October 7th to October 13th, 1864. Last week, we talked about continued action in the defense of Richmond with Peebles Farm and the Darbytown Road. We also had action at Saltville, another unfortunate instance where black soldiers are treated with brutality. Federal troops would return to that region, however, so stay tuned for that. This week, we do have a couple of events. We need to start Hood's Tennessee campaign, a kind of fizzle to his career as Army commander that will only cause more Southern casualties, and we also need to talk about Mosby's train robbery. But before we do all of that, we do need to say goodbye to a Chief Justice. And before we talk about Roger Taney, we need to talk about some Patreon content. And of course, we do have some that has been posted here. In this month of October, we went back to the Battle of the Crater and did a picture slideshow on that. So if that sounds like something that would interest you, just looking through some pictures, some photos that I took myself and talking about the events and what happened there, that is posted to the Patreon. We also do movie reviews, going back to the well of movie reviews there next month, as we have probably previously alluded to. And we also do memoir reviews as well, and a couple other mixed in episodes, some odds and ends. So if any of that sounds like it would interest you, some extra Civil War content, there is a link to the Patreon in the show description, and those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They're greatly appreciated. So this week, we will say goodbye to Roger Taney, who is dead at the age of 87, the same day that Maryland abolished his slavery. In some ways, it is fitting we introduced Taney in some of our early episodes, and now as the war's end draws nearer, we now say goodbye. Taney was a key supporter of slavery and racial inequality, and also pro-Confederate, so his passing is not necessarily terrible for progress. It will give Lincoln a chance to nominate a replacement, regardless of whether he was re-elected. Salmon Chase would be given the nod, giving an ally to the Supreme Court. Taney has a complicated legacy due to the Dred Scott case, but in some ways I think it is interesting to see someone from the Jackson administration serving on the Supreme Court for 28 years, now being ushered out, a kind of release of the old firm, shall we say, and now we are moving into a more modern age. We talk a lot about how there is a shift in the Civil War. It's the first modern war, and we're moving into these modern times. Well, when you have somebody that's been around since we were using pistols and dueling and Andrew Jackson, then yeah, that's going to stand in the way of progress. And I'm sure there is some kind of commentary there, shall we say, about the Supreme Court and whatnot. I'm just going to leave that alone for now, and we're going to focus here in the 1860s. Our journey this week is actually going to take us back to Georgia, to a place that we have previously mentioned. It has been a minute since Atlanta has fallen, but remember that John Bell Hood still has his army in the field, and still has not an insignificant amount of troops. Now, Sherman had decided to remain in Atlanta and rest his army. Much like in the East, many of his soldiers had their enlistment periods expire or otherwise were heading home on furlough. Remember that the troops on the train in Centralia were heading home from the Atlanta campaign. Hood would originally spend some time at Lovejoy Station, watching for the next move of the Federals. A meeting with Jefferson Davis would move the Confederates to act first, however. Now, Davis is not happy with Hood. Atlanta had fallen, his offensive general had ill-planned attacks, and that had cost many casualties as well in the process. It was not off the table to replace Hood, in fact. But the usual problem of who are you going to get to actually lead the army is going to plague the Confederate president yet again. Hardee was being cashiered out of the department, his corps being taken over by Frank Cheatham. Now, you would say, and we will talk about this in a future episode as we do kind of a look back on Hood's tenure as Army commander, but you would say, at least he's not Braxton Bragg. Well, he does a lot of the same things that Braxton Bragg does. So we have Bragg, a very aggressive commander, or at least we can't really say that about him. He attacks in several situations. Maybe ill-advised defensive action at Chattanooga as well. But he's also going to blame his sub-commanders. Now, Hardee's going to get a lot of the blame by Hood. And I don't think that's necessarily fair for Hardee, who is asked to shift his entire forces through the city in the attack on Bald Hill, the Battle of Atlanta, and that doesn't really pan out the way that Hood wants it to. Now, there could have been an opportunity there, sure, but it was going to be pretty difficult to execute what Hood was wanting to have happen, especially when Hood is not going to be in the field actually commanding and reacting to those situations that are on the ground. That's a big criticism we have of George B. McClellan. He doesn't really do that. He has his plan. The plan can't be deviated from. Very linear in thinking. He cannot deviate from that. And at least at Antietam, right, he gets criticized for not being on the ground and developing to actions as they come. So we have that same kind of criticism of Hood in these actions here around Atlanta. All that being said, and once again, we'll talk about that in a future episode, Hardee, who is the author of an infantry tactic manual, might have actually been a good choice. However, once again, he gets a lot of blame for the Atlanta campaign. A.P. Stewart had very little experience, so he was kind of the next guy up, and so he was deemed to be not a great fit. P.G.T. Beauregard was not someone Davis trusted, as the two had bumped heads again outside of Richmond, and while he would not be giving tactical control, he is going to be given departmental control, meaning he is technically going to be over the Army of Tennessee, but you could also see it as getting him away from Richmond. This is also how Davis is going to have a compromise, so to speak, with the Confederate public, the Southern populace, in that there is some fair criticism of Hood. He doesn't do a very good job at Atlanta. He loses the city. And although it was not necessarily a strategic loss, it was more symbolic than anything else, that is going to help lead to Lincoln's re-election, he is not performing well in the field, despite all these reports that he's giving back about how, these battles are sort of draws or even successes in some cases when they really aren't. And because of that, Davis needs to come up with a compromise. So he has P.G.T. Beauregard become the departmental commander. So it's kind of like he's soft firing Hood. Like Hood's not going to be calling the shots anymore, but really the unwritten agreement, the reason why there's this meeting is that Hood is going to be given complete tactical control on the ground because Davis doesn't want Beauregard to be in charge of that either. Now you could also be saying, what about Joe Johnston? Well, Joe Johnston had his chance. He's not going to be given command here. Again, he's not done with our story. He's actually going to be playing a part here in 1865, but at least for now he's still going to be on the bench. Speaking of Joe Johnston, we also have James Longstreet as a kind of intriguing option. Maybe he can take over. He didn't do very well in the Knoxville campaign. He's still recovering from his wounds, though, that he received at the Wilderness, so he's not going to be an option either. Hood is going to remain in the lead of the army, but a new plan is going to be called for. The Army of Tennessee would be needed to move to crush the lines of supply for William T. Sherman. This would involve moving to northern Georgia, Atlanta, and then ultimately into Tennessee, maybe striking at Chattanooga. Now Sherman still has a tenuous line of supply back toward that city. If this line was truly threatened, then maybe the Federals would chase Hood, and Hood could find ground advantageous for a defensive battle that would bring a victory. Remember that many of the defensive actions during the Atlanta campaign had gone the way for the rebels, at great cost to the Union, naming a few Pickett's Mill, Kennesaw Mountain, and Utoy Creek as good examples. Refitting the army at Lovejoy's and then Palmetto, Georgia, the rebels would start to trek north, moving back through the familiar territory. The Federals had decided to set up blockhouses along the supply line to protect it, but there would be some opportunity given enough force. There would be a great first target for Hood at a cut for the railroad known as Allatoona Pass. Now, if you have ever been to Allatoona Pass, it is actually a very nice, smaller battlefield, but the most impressive part is the cut in which the railroad passed through, flanked by two very large plateaus, kind of a cut through a hill, so to speak. Hitting this depot and then actually destroying a railroad bridge beyond would be a big hindrance to supplies coming in to Sherman's army. While the garrison was minimal, occupying earthworks here, John Corse and his division were in the area, having been sent to Rome, Georgia. In early October, Hood had gathered up some prisoners in his drive to the north, despite being really without too much cavalry. Only Red Jackson remained, with Wheeler still messing around in Tennessee, but accomplishing very little. As a result of these movements, however, Corse was ordered to Allatoona. That pass, with its deep cut, along with the bridge over the Etowah River, were very important to Sherman. At the pass, there was the garrison commander, John Torlett, whose command included the 7th Illinois armed with Henry repeating rifles. Corse would set about viewing the earthworks, there being a star fort amongst other lines. This hasty inspection and arrival of the Federal general would prove to be quite fortuitous, for that very night A.P. Stewart's corps moved into position. Samuel French's division will be tasked with taking the pass, his command including Young's brigade of Texas regiments and 1 North Carolina regiment, Cockrell's Missourians, and Claudius Sears's Mississippi brigade. Deciding to not take the works head-on, French would send Sears to a flanking position while keeping Young and Cockrell set to attack Rowet's Redoubt, named for the major there commanding, with part of the 7th and 93rd Illinois. Perhaps a battle would not be in the offing, though, French sending a request for surrender. I have placed the forces under my command in such positions that you are surrounded, and to avoid a needless effusion of blood, I call on you to surrender your forces at once and unconditionally. 5 moments will be allowed for you to decide. Should you accept to this, you will be treated in the most honorable manner as prisoners of war. Corse would claim that his response was, your communication demanding surrender of my command I acknowledge receipt of, and respectfully reply that we are prepared for the needless effusion of blood, whenever it is agreeable to you. Reportedly, there is some question as to whether this was actually his response, but it does make for a good story. The plan had been for Sears and his Mississippi brigade to begin with their assault, however, there was difficulty getting into position. French threw forward first Cockrell and then Young. They would overrun the Rowett Redoubt, the Illinois troops being forced to fall back to the inner defenses. Heavy casualties were inflicted using the repeating weapons, however. The veteran troops would see some hand-to-hand fighting as they gained the earthworks, some accounts proving that the fighting, while on the smallish scale, was still quite fierce. The Mississippi troops were able to gain ground, but ultimately they were stopped by the Federal defenders. Firefighting would break out between the two sides as the Union troops refused to budge. Corse and Rowlett were both wounded during the fighting, but the Northerners were able to hang on. French would be led to believe that more Union troops were on their way to the field, and so would call off the attacks. His command had lost some 800 men compared to 700 Union troops. For the amount of men that were actually engaged, these are actually pretty high percentage casualties. To show additionally just how intense the fighting was, Corse brought with him 250,000 rounds of ammunition, and only 200 rounds remained after the fighting. So, Allatoona being a bust, French would rejoin the Confederates, Hood continuing with his movements. He would make for familiar territory, first moving to Resaca. A.S.D. Lee's division would be tasked with investing the small garrison, pitting some 7,000 men against 600. The commander of the garrison, Colonel Clark Weaver, would be given a demand of surrender by Hood. Now Hood would try to pull the same ruse that Forrest had worked with in the past, which was a demand of surrender or threaten that no prisoners would be taken. Weaver would be outraged by that insinuation, his command resolving to fight. There would be skirmishing and sharpshooting, the Kentucky cavalry coming to the assistance, as well as some infantry reinforcements for the northern garrison. Resaca would hold, but there would be another garrison at Dalton which would not. Unfortunately, this would be garrisoned by the 44th United States Colored Troops, made up of formerly enslaved individuals from the general region. At first, the garrison, commanded by Colonel Lewis Johnson, would refuse a demand of surrender, but facing pressure, would then capitulate. The captured white officers would be separated from their command, and the former soldiers would be pressed into service, tearing up railroad track. They would continue to be pressed into service for the Confederates, building defenses and repairing railroads. In the meantime, Beauregard would arrive to confer with Hood. The Creole general would then move into Alabama to set up a logistics network for Hood's army. By this time, Sherman had started to pursue, his command clashing with the rear guard of the Army of Tennessee. Hood was not able to find a sufficient spot to give battle, and was feeling the vice of Sherman coming up from the south and reinforcements coming down from Chattanooga. He would then decide to move his army into Alabama, following Beauregard. Forrest was going to join with Wheeler's cavalry and take over the mounted arm, and the army would start to wreak some havoc in Tennessee. Sherman, though, would grow tired of this pursuit, amidst his plan to keep moving to the sea. He would send Thomas to Nashville with the 4th Corps and John Schofield's command before return to Atlanta. We are going to pick back up on Hood's Tennessee adventure in a future episode. As we close out today's episode, we will talk about Mosby's train robbery, otherwise known as the Greenback Raid. Remember that part of the problem for any federal force operating in the Shenandoah Valley is that their lines of supply are going to be beset upon by the Gray Ghost and his partisan Rangers. Now, we have mentioned there being some action from the Rangers. Mosby was always a worry for federal generals. A contingent by Richard Blazer would use relatively the same tactics and try to combat Mosby's partisans. Blazer eventually would be captured and given much respect by Mosby, as this was one of the more formidable opponents that he had faced during the war. Reportedly, there were to be reprisals before the death of John Roger Meigs. Montgomery Meigs actually put a bounty on the killer. The same day as the train raid, there would be some Rangers executed by Custer, following a brief engagement with troopers under Charles Lowell. Wesley Merritt would actually also order the execution of a young man who was not a Ranger, although most likely was looking to join up. In retaliation, Mosby would execute several captured Federals, an action that was sanctioned by Robert E. Lee. Some would be shot while others were hung, captured prisoners being forced to draw lots. A sign that would include the phrase "measure for measure" would be placed on the corpses. A truce for these kinds of tactics would be called for in November. Now, we covered this and the Greenback Raid in our review of Mosby's memoirs, so make sure to check that out in the Patreon feed. On October 14th, Mosby's Rangers would tear up some track, forcing a train to derail. In the aftermath, they would take some $172,000 in greenbacks, giving the raid its name. Now, we actually have a first-hand account for somebody who participated, and I think they can describe the events better. Late in the evening, we pulled up in a body of woods where we dismounted and left our horses with a detail, then marched a few hundred yards across a field and reached the railroad at a deep cut. Here we went to work on the track and sewed at one side elevated on fence rails and old ties to ensure the upsetting of the engine when it should come to that point. Then we laid along the bank and waited. Anticipations of what was certain to happen and pictures of what might happen in the next half hour set my nerves tingling. It is not a pleasant thing to lie calmly under the stars and contemplate the usual contingencies of a straight fight, but the possible horrors of a railroad wreck and the sufferings of women, children, and not improbably the presence of a carload of infantry took such tangible shapes in the mediations as to give me a very bad half hour. Presently I heard the train coming, and I hurried around, waking up the boys. I then went back to my place and watched, and listened to the thumping of my heart. Nearer and louder came the sounds, and quicker beat my pulses. Directly the headlight of the engine shot across a curve not far off, and an engine rushed almost under me. It seemed my heart well nigh choked me. And then there was a tremendous thump, and the shriek of the steam, and the sound of a single shot, and then the deluge. "Board her, boys!" rang up the colonel's crisp, steady tones. That brought me back to the sense and braced me. The conductor of the train seemed to take in the situation more promptly than any of us, and never for a moment lost his nerve. He jumped off between his train and us, swinging a lighted lantern, and cried out that he surrendered the train. Down the bank we rushed. As I ran up the steps of the platform of the coach, a tall ranger was standing with his pistol poked through the door ajar, calling on somebody to surrender. Being short and slim, I slipped under his arm and jumped in. On the first seat sat a soldier with a lady beside him, who, as I stopped, assured me that her husband was a sick man. Just behind them sat a gentleman across, whose portliness stretched a gold-chain watch. He must have noticed that it fascinated my gaze, for he promptly presented it to me, without detaching it from its beautiful gold watch. Of course, I could not accept such munificence without some inquiry into the condition of his finances. The generous old man responded to this with the offer of his pocketbook, but I had barely noticed its plump appearance when a long lank arm reached over my shoulder and appropriated with my modesty might have declined. By this time, the boys were crowding into the car. As I moved down the aisle, I felt a gentle touch on my arm, and a sweet voice asked if I would protect them. Of course I would, and took my seat between as pretty a pair of cherubs as ever made a fool of a soldier boy. And I stayed there too, until the looting of the car was completed. After the looting of the cars, they were burnt, but they had to be emptied of certain valuables. First, of course, came the ladies, who were disposed as comfortably as practicable with their baggage, which was gathered from the car. You may be sure that my fair protégés received every needed attention, not only from myself, but from the other gallants whom their beauty attracted. I believe they were the belles of the occasion, and I am sure that they were really enjoyed by the affair, and Alice had many stories to relate of their flirtations that night with Mosby's gorillas. The occupants of one car were German immigrants, who could not understand even enough English to learn how to get out of a fire. They sat immovable, under every inducement to change base. Finally, when the situation was reported to the colonel, his eye fell on a big bundle of newspapers which had been intercepted, and he ordered that they be set afire and thrown into the car. This gave rise to the only comical feature of the occasion. When the firebrands fell into the aisle, the dumb creatures went tumbling heel over head out of the window. We ourselves barely escaped a stampede. Cab Maddox had been left with his horse detail back in the woods. Now Cab was nothing if not enterprising, and as he saw the lights and heard the sounds, he just couldn't stand it. So here he came, rushing across the field. When he came up, it was some cock and bull story about how the Yankees were coming. Nothing can be more demoralizing to a cavalryman than to be attacked away from his horse, and for a moment or two the situation was more than threatening. The colonel, however, promptly got control of the affairs, and when he satisfied himself that it was a false alarm, maybe Cab didn't get a roasting. It wound up with a threat of that direst of all punishments to a Mosby man, to be sent back to regular service. Before the cars were set afire, such things as appeared valuable were taken out. As an officer whom West Aldridge had ordered out stepped upon the ground, bearing an innocent-looking satchel, Charlie Deer courteously relieved him of his baggage. As he parted with it, he charged Charlie to be careful with it, as it contained greenbacks. "Greenbacks, greenbacks," shouted Charlie, as he made his way toward the colonel. An investigation revealed a great roll of uncut sheets of the long green, and Charlie's eyes were not the only ones that assumed the dimensions of saucers at the ravishing sight. About this time, West Aldridge came up with a familiar fairy tale and substantial exhibits to bring it into the realm of fact. In his final cleanup of the car, he noticed a large dark object on the floor between two seats, covered with a handsome gum blanket. There was no response to the investigating kick that he gave to it, but the lifting of the blanket revealed a Yankee officer, crouching and clinging to a forlorn hope that he might be overlooked. So tenaciously did he embrace it that West's call on him to come along was unheeded, until it was emphasized by the click of his revolver in his ear. And then, as Major Ruggles rose to his feet and yielded to his fate, he managed to drop his poncho into the place where he had hidden. He moved off with great reluctance, as one who had left his heart behind him. These peculiarities of behavior recurred to West's mind after he had turned over his prisoner at the car door, and impelled him to return and get the precious poncho. I think he must have been afraid of snakes, for he investigated it again with his foot before picking it up, and found it to be a heavy tin box. As he bore it away, it suggested treasure to his excited imagination. Then he sought Colonel Mosby. "What have you got?" a voice inquired as he was making his way to the crowd. "Gold, a safe of gold," he gasped, and his eyes glittered wildly in the starlight. "Come here, boy," and the voice was low and stern and metallic. "You don't have to find Mosby or tell anyone about this. Let's you and I strike for London with the stuff." I would not have liked to be the object of the contempt that flashed from his eyes, nor to be the one of whom he hissed back, "And be a thief?" The man to whom he said it was one of the desperadoes of the command, but he only answered, "Well, you are a damn fool," and stood out of his way as he went on toward Colonel Mosby. Before this find was published, and while the fire and smoke from the burning train were going up, Major Ruggles remarked in taunting tones, as he stood on the bank amongst the boys, that he had contributed upward of $200,000 to that fire. "Look here, Major," West replied, and he pulled back the gum and tapped the box with a caressing hand. The Major's countenance fell. When the contents of the tin box and the satchel were added together, they amounted to a handsome sum of over $160,000. I had as well add here that the next day, at Bloomfield, they were impartially divided out amongst the boys, who were on that raid, so that each one received about $2,200 in crisp new greenbacks, in uncut sheets of various denominations. My old haversack never bore such contents before, and to tell the truth, my eyes had never fallen upon such a sight since. Some of our prisoners informed us that even a larger sum of money than this, belonging to another paymaster, was missed by us, and consumed with the burnt train. Possibly this was true, and probably it was said to make us feel bad. The only man who did not participate in the division was Colonel Mosby himself. No sort of solicitations from his men could induce him to take a share. His empathetic response was that he was fighting for glory, not for spoils. I have always wondered what he took us for. But so sensitive on this point was he, that he would not even permit Mrs. Mosby to accept a purse of gold, which the boys subsequently made up and tendered her. So there we go. We have an account of the Greenback raid, and there's a couple of things to unpack here. I think it is interesting. It does very much sound like a kind of story from the Old West, maybe an Old West train robbery kind of deal. Maybe you've seen it in a movie or heard before. It's very romantic in how it is unfolded. And this is very different, I think, from the partisan rangers that we see here in the Eastern Theater, Mosby's command, versus our guerrillas that we see in Missouri. It's a very different tone, right? There's not this merriment. You know, we read about it at Centralia, and granted that was from the Union perspective, and now we have this from an individual of Mosby's command, and it is very interesting to contrast the two. Very brutal, very savage on one hand, and very genteel, and still very much according to maybe Victorian etiquette, or maybe the rules of war, shall we say, here in the East. I think we can very much have imagined, and we can very much, given the Centralia incident, think is a realistic assumption that these officers, this paymaster, would have been executed had they been in Missouri, right? We could very much see that, whereas they get a very different treatment in this case. Now, the other thing that I do want to talk about and point out here is that there is this threat that if you are a partisan ranger, you could be returned to your normal service, your regular service. And that is a very big threat. So it's helping these men stay in line. Now, if you are a guerrilla in Missouri, you don't have that threat because you're pretty much just going to do whatever you want. Whereas here we have this outfit that is still technically part of the Confederate Army, and that's why it's very different than your guerrillas, your Bloody Bill Andersons, your Todds that are there in more of a violent situation in that border state. So we have this threat. And it's an interesting theme as well, is that as the war progresses and gets to the latter stages, we actually saw this in John O. Castler's memoir that we talked about in our Patreon feed. He's going to want to go into the irregular warfare business. There's not going to be as many men who want to continue in regular service. For those that still want to fight, that don't necessarily want to do it in the regular Confederate Army, this is going to be an option that they try to turn to. So there is going to be more of a theme of that. I can stay home, I can still do something toward the cause, but I'm not going to be in these conventional warfare situations. So it is also interesting to point that out and see how that theme changes as the war progresses. So we're going to bring everything to a close there. We had a very busy episode. We covered Roger Taney's death, the beginning of Hood's Tennessee campaign, and Mosby's Greenback raid. Next week, we will head back to the valley. Jubal Early is determined to turn the tables using his infantry. The two armies will meet yet again at Cedar Creek. We will also head to Vermont, not to see the leaves, but to see one of the weirdest actions of the war. If you're confused, don't worry, we are going to get a full breakdown of the St. Albans raid. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.